SSPX Masses and the Sunday Obligation, John Salza responds to Father Chad Ripperger and Jimmy Akin. This article can be found at trueorfalsepope.com and is reproduced here vocally with permission. SSPX Masses and the Sunday Obligation, John Salza responds to Father Chad Ripperger and Jimmy Akin, September 2024. In the span of just a few days, two well-known Catholics publicly gave what I maintain are erroneous conclusions regarding whether or not SSPX Masses fulfilled the Sunday obligation. On September 18, 2024, in an interview with Gene Zanetti, Father Chad Ripperger stated that SSPX Masses fulfill the obligation, and on September 21, 2024, in an article by Daniel Payne for Catholic News Agency about the Carmelite nuns who defected to the SSPX, Jimmy Akin of Catholic Answers is also quoted as suggesting that SSPX Masses fulfill the obligation because he says Catholics can attend their Masses and receive Holy Communion. As I will demonstrate in this article, both statements fall short of a proper understanding of canon law, which lead to the erroneous conclusion. Note that I already addressed this issue at length in my November 2021 article, Do SSPX Masses Fulfill the Sunday Obligation? This previous article also analyzes all the negative judgments by the Holy See regarding SSPX Mass attendance. However, because of the gravity of the issue concerning many souls and the influence these two gentlemen have in Catholic circles, along with new errors that were made in their presentations, I believe another reply is warranted. An incorrect understanding of Canon 1248. From their recent statements, it appears that Mr. Akin and Mr. Ripperger's conclusions are based upon an incomplete understanding of Canon 1248, Article 1 of the 1983 Code of Canon Law, which explains how a Catholic fulfills the Sunday obligation. Quote, a person who assists at a Mass celebrated anywhere in a Catholic rite, either on the feast day itself or in the evening of the preceding day, satisfies the obligation of participating in the Mass, unquote. Based on their recent statements cited below, Mr. Akin and Father Ripperger have incorrectly interpreted the term Catholic rite in Canon 1248 to simply mean a valid Catholic missal or liturgical rite or ritual. To prove that point, in the interview cited above, Father Ripperger referred to canon law without actually citing the relevant canon and stated, quote, they changed canon law to where you fulfill your Sunday obligation by attending a Catholic ritual said by a Catholic priest, unquote. Ripperger then applied his understanding of canon law to SSPX Masses and said Catholics can fulfill their obligation at such Masses. Quote, technically speaking, according to canon law, yes, you can fulfill the obligation, unquote. In the CNA article, Mr. Akin is quoted as similarly stating, quote, canon law stipulates that Catholics can participate in the Eucharistic sacrifice and receive Holy Communion in any Catholic rite. Since SSPX is using the approved 1962 rite of the Mass, the faithful can attend it and receive Holy Communion, unquote. In other words, Father Ripperger and Mr. Akin have concluded that one fulfills the Sunday obligation by assisting at a Mass which uses an approved missal, or in their words, ritual or liturgical rite, without regard to whether the church in which the Mass is celebrated is a Catholic church, e.g., celebrated in a church governed by a bishop with ordinary jurisdiction, and thus in hierarchical communion with the Pope and College of Bishops as part of the universal church. Because the SSPX celebrates the church-approved 1962 Missal, the extraordinary form of the Roman Rite of the Latin Church, Ripperger and Akin conclude that SSPX attendees are celebrating in a Catholic rite, and therefore meet the ecclesiastical precept of Canon 1248. However, this is not and cannot be the correct interpretation of Canon 1248 because it would mean that Catholics could also fulfill their Sunday obligation at a sedevacantist Mass, whose priests use the 1962 Missal, or an Old Catholic Mass, whose priests use both the 1962 and 1969 Missals, and mention Pope Francis in the canon. It would even mean that Catholics could satisfy the obligation at a Mass celebrated by one who, though validly ordained, established his own church in his mother's basement without ecclesiastical approval, of course, so long as he used an approved missal. In all of these cases, the Masses offered by these schismatic priests do not satisfy the obligation because they are not offered in a Catholic church, that is, in a local particular church, e.g., a diocese governed by a bishop in union with the Pope, which is part of the universal church. Enter Canon 1246, Article 1. This is not my opinion, but rather a requirement of the faith itself, as provided in both the Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 2177, and her canon law. Canon 1246, Article 1 says, quote, "The Lord's Day, on which the Paschal Mystery is celebrated, is by apostolic tradition to be observed in the universal church, in universa ecclesia, as the primary holy day of obligation. In the same way, the following holy days are to be observed: the Nativity of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Epiphany, the Ascension of Christ, the Feast of the Body and Blood of Christ, the Feast of Mary, the Mother of God, her Immaculate Conception, her Assumption, the Feast of St. Joseph, the Feast of the Apostles, Saints Peter and Paul, and the Feast of All Saints." According to Canon 1246 and the Catechism of the Catholic Church, it is a matter of divine revelation, apostolic tradition, ex apostolica traditione, that Sundays and holy days must be observed in the universal church in order to satisfy the holy day of obligation. This is because Christ at the very beginning directly established the universal church through the papacy and college of bishops in St. Peter and the Apostles, which existed prior to the establishment of the particular territorial churches in the apostolic and post-apostolic periods. Hence, the Mass and sacraments were first celebrated in the universal church. Today, after having put down her roots in a variety of cultural, social, and human terrains, the universal church now also consists of the local Church of Rome, to which the primacy is attached, and local particular churches, i.e. dioceses or eparchies, throughout the world in union with it. This universal church has 24 churches sui juris and 6 rites throughout the world. The 6 rites are, in the East, the Alexandrian, Armenian, Byzantine, Eastern Syrian, and Western Syrian, and in the West, the Latin Rite. The 24 churches sui juris are self-governing churches established by the supreme authority of the universal church, the Pope, and are part of the universal church. They are also known as autonomous particular churches because they have distinct theological, liturgical, spiritual, and canonical traditions. The largest church sui juris is the Latin Church, which is the only such church in the West. The 23 other churches sui juris exist in the East. Finally, the 24 churches sui juris are made up of local particular churches throughout the world, each of which is headed by a bishop and, as noted above, called a diocese in the Latin Church and an eparchy in the Eastern churches. In a diocese, there are local parish churches headed by a pastor who is appointed by the bishop. The new commentary on the Code of Canon Law, compiled by the leading canonists in North America and Europe, confirms the foregoing conclusions, thereby directly contradicting the position of Ripperger and Akin. The commentary explicitly provides that a Catholic rite in Canon 1248 does not merely refer to a valid missal, but to a Mass celebrated in a Catholic church sui juris. Quote, "The Mass must be celebrated in a Catholic rite, i.e. in the liturgical rite of any Catholic church sui juris, but not in a church which is not in full communion with the Catholic Church, although using a Catholic liturgical rite." Unquote. What does all this mean? It means that in order for a Mass to satisfy the Sunday obligation, it must not only be celebrated according to an approved missal, but also offered in the universal church, that is, in union with the Pope and College of Bishops, in one of the 24 churches sui juris, which includes the local particular churches, e.g. dioceses, and their respective parish churches throughout the world. The SSPX is not a Catholic church or equivalent. The obvious problem with Father Ripperger and Mr. Akin's conclusion is that SSPX Masses are not observed in the universal church, that is, in one of the 24 Catholic churches sui juris, within a particular church, a diocese, headed by a bishop with ordinary jurisdiction. nor does the SSPX claim that to be the case. Hence, the SSPX does not offer Mass in a Catholic rite or in the Universal Church in order to qualify for satisfying the Sunday obligation. As Father John Lessard Thibodeau explained in his recent canonical study of the SSPX, quote, "The erection of a church sui juris is an executive act of the Holy Father. It does not happen as a mere matter of the passage of time, self-declaration, or by any means ipso facto or ipso jure," unquote. As Canon 373 provides, quote, "It is within the competence of the supreme authority alone to establish particular churches. Once they are lawfully established, the law itself gives them juridical personality," unquote. Father Lessard Thibodeau goes on to state the obvious, which the SSPX also concedes. Quote, "There is no evidence that the SSPX has been erected, defined, or even described by competent authority as a church, sui juris, by competent authority." He further says, "Similarly, there is no evidence that the SSPX has been erected by competent authority, or defined as a particular church in any form recognized by the Holy See. Such erection or recognition does not appear plausible under current ecclesiastical law," unquote. And in that quote, he had different references to various canons. All citations you can find at the link that I will give in the description below to the article itself at the bottom. Therefore, Masses offered by the SSPX are not celebrated in a Catholic rite, i.e. in the liturgical rite of any Catholic church sui juris. The SSPX is also not part of the Universal Church because it was lawfully suppressed by Pope Paul VI in 1975, at which time it was legally extinguished, lost its juridic personality according to canon law. In other words, upon its suppression, the SSPX disappeared off the map of the Latin Rite. This is another reason why SSPX Masses are not observed in the Universal Church, because the SSPX is not recognized as part of the Latin Church sui juris. This is why Pope Benedict XVI in 2009 stated that, quote, "The society has no canonical status in the Church, and its ministers, even though they have been freed of the ecclesiastical penalty, do not legitimately exercise any ministry in the Church," unquote. This is also why Cardinal Burke stated, quote, "At the present moment, they, the SSPX, are not part of the one Roman Catholic Church throughout the world," unquote. Accordingly, the SSPX is not a church in full communion with the Catholic Church, and thus their Masses do not fulfill the obligation. In summary, Canon 1246 proves that even if the word rite in Canon 1248 would refer exclusively to an approved liturgical missal or ritual, as Mr. Akin and Father Ripperger maintain, but which is not the case, such Mass must still be observed in the Universal Church in order to satisfy the Sunday and Holy Days obligation, and SSPX Masses are not so observed. The SSPX is not part of the Roman Catholic Church, and their Masses are not offered in the Universal Church because they are not offered in Catholic churches governed by bishops with title and ordinary jurisdiction who are united to their head, the Pope. Therefore, SSPX Masses do not satisfy the obligation. Other issues in the recent statements. In addition to their faulty interpretation of Canon 1248, Father Ripperger and Mr. Akin made some other misleading statements in their recent interviews regarding the SSPX and the Sunday obligation. As noted above, Father Ripperger stated that the Church, quote, "changed canon law to where you fulfill your Sunday obligation by attending a Catholic ritual said by a Catholic priest," unquote, as if the Church previously prohibited one from attending Mass at non-Catholic sects on Sunday, but now allows it. This, of course, is false. Canon law did not change in regard to the need to observe Mass in the Universal Church and a Catholic rite as properly understood. In the 1917 Code of Canon Law, Canon 1249, the predecessor to the current Canon 1248, also required Mass to be celebrated in a Catholic rite to fulfill the obligation. In fact, the canon identified specific loci for such celebrations that were part of the Universal Church through their juridic unity with local particular churches, such as parish churches, public or semi-public oratories, and certain private cemeteries, but not in other private oratories without permission of the Holy See. Hence, there was no change between the 1917 and 1983 codes in regard to the requirement to assist at Mass in the Universal Church to satisfy the obligation. Father Ripperger's assertion that all one needs is a Catholic ritual and a Catholic priest also begs the question of what he means by Catholic priest. Who, according to Father Ripperger, is a legitimate Catholic minister? Canon 265 helps answer that question by stating that, quote, every cleric must be incardinated in a particular church or in a personal prelature or an institute of consecrated life or a society which has this faculty, unquote. That is, under a bishop with ordinary jurisdiction. Sound familiar? And that, quote, acephalous or wandering clergy are in no way to be allowed, unquote. That means legitimate Catholic ministers would certainly not include the acephalous priests of the SSPX, SSPX Resistance, Sedevacantists, Old Catholics, and other independent wandering clergy because they are not incardinated and thus, quote-unquote, in no way allowed, even though they might use an approved Catholic ritual or the approved 1962 rite of Mass. If Father Ripperger would agree that the validly ordained Sedevacantist or Old Catholic priests of today are not legitimate Catholic ministers, even though they use approved missals, then why would he view the SSPX clergy differently? After all, these groups all suffer from the same ecclesiological defects, e.g., their organizations are not part of the Roman Catholic Church. They are separated from her divine government. Their bishops have no title or ordinary jurisdiction. Their priests are illicitly ordained and not incardinated, etc. That Pope Benedict XVI lifted the declared censure of excommunication on the SSPX bishops for the sole purpose of bringing them into the Church, which the SSPX ultimately refused to do, does not change these facts and make SSPX clergy legitimate Catholic ministers. Pope Paul VI also lifted the declared excommunications on the Orthodox clergy, but the SSPX would be the first to note that the Orthodox clergy are non-Catholic ministers who remain in schism. That Pope Francis granted SSPX clergy the faculty to hear confessions and conditionally witness marriages, since these sacraments were theretofore invalid for 40 years, also does not change the facts. The Pope has the authority to grant such faculties to non-Catholic ministers, e.g., the sacraments of penance and extreme unction are valid in certain separated Eastern churches, which are administered by schismatic priests and bishops, because the Pope has not withdrawn their jurisdiction. It would be interesting to understand how Father Ripperger actually defines a Catholic priest. After claiming that a Catholic can receive Holy Communion and presumably satisfy their Sunday obligation at an SSPX Mass, both of which are false, Mr. Akin also added, quote, the fact the SSPX Mass, is being celebrated in a canonically irregular situation does not change this, unquote. Akin then pointed out that, quote, every time a priest commits a liturgical abuse, it creates a canonically irregular situation, unquote, but that the Church, quote, does not want the laity to have to judge which canonically irregular situations involve too much of a departure from the law, unquote. Thus, the faithful's quote, right to attend and receive Holy Communion in any Catholic rite is protected, unquote. Mr. Akin's argument is a straw man, because the lyceity of the Mass, or the canonical status of the minister, is not relevant to whether the Mass satisfies the Sunday obligation under Canon 1248. What matters is whether the Mass is observed in the Universal Church, through a local particular church governed by a bishop with ordinary jurisdiction, and hence in union with the Pope. It is true that Catholics are not obligated to know the canonical status of a priest. Is he under a censure? Or assess the degree of liturgical deviations to determine if they render the Mass illicit, even though Archbishop Lefebvre would judge the intentions of Novus Ordo priests in concluding their Masses were invalid. But a Catholic is obligated to know whether the church he is attending is in union with his local bishop. This indeed is of apostolic tradition. The early church fathers, such as St. Ignatius of Antioch, emphasized this obligation from the very beginning. Quote, it is not lawful without the bishop, unquote. We thus see that the purpose of Canon 1248 is to affirm that a Latin Rite Catholic may fulfill his Sunday obligation in the Universal Church by also assisting at a Mass offered in any one of the 23 Eastern churches sui juris, which are all part of the Universal Church. but not at a chapel which is not in full communion with the Catholic Church, not even a separated Eastern Church, even if it uses an approved Catholic liturgical rite. Of course, there would be little need for a law regulating where Catholics could attend Mass to satisfy the obligation if they could assist at Masses offered by any priest in any setting who used a valid missal. To reiterate, the ability to legally satisfy the Sunday obligation is tied to the church in which the Mass is celebrated and not merely to the validity of the minister's ordination or the missal he uses. Those who have used Canon 1248 to conclude that SSPX Masses fulfill the Sunday obligation have not understood this important distinction. CNA also quotes Akin as referring to Canon 923 in his defense of assisting at SSPX Masses. Canon 923 says, quote, Christ's faithful may participate in the Eucharistic sacrifice and receive Holy Communion in any Catholic rite without prejudice to the provisions of Canon 844, unquote. What are the problems with Mr. Akin's reference? First, Canon 923 has nothing to do with the Sunday obligation. The relevant canons on the obligation are 1246 to 1248. Thus, if Mr. Akin is using Canon 923 to argue SSPX Masses fulfill the obligation, he would be wrong in doing so, although I cannot determine if that is his argument. Second, and more importantly, Canon 923 uses the term Catholic rite in the exact same way as Canon 1248. The new commentary on the Code of Canon Law explains, quote, the reference to any Catholic rite in Canon 923 means any Catholic Church sui juris, unquote. The commentary also notes that Canon 866 of the 1917 Code was the predecessor to Canon 923, and its use of rite clearly refers to one of the 6 rites of the Universal Church. This is because while the canon allows Catholics to receive the Eucharist, quote, in whatever rite it is confected, unquote, it also urges Catholics, quote, to satisfy their Easter communion in their own rite, unquote. That's Canon 866, Article 2, which obviously means for Catholics in the West, in the Latin rite, and not a particular missal. The commentary also states, quote, now there are no qualifications concerning the participation and reception of the Eucharist in other Catholic churches sui juris. However, the faithful may not receive the Eucharist of a church or ecclesiastical community which is not in full communion with the Catholic Church, except for the case mentioned in Canon 844, Article 2, unquote. As already demonstrated, the SSPX is not a church or ecclesiastical community in full communion with the Catholic Church, nor does it qualify for the exception in Canon 844, Article 2. Mr. Akin's position is refuted once again. A brief word about Canon 844, Article 2. This canon allows Catholics in extremely limited circumstances to approach non-Catholic ministers for penance, the Eucharist, and extreme unction, quote, in whose churches, in quorum ecclesia, these sacraments are valid, unquote. As I explained in detail in my article, Do SSPX Masses Fulfill the Sunday Obligation? The SSPX is not a church within the meaning of Canon 844, Article 2, as it was never established as a church by competent ecclesiastical authority, either in the universal sense of a church sui juris, for example, or a local particular church headed by a bishop with ordinary jurisdiction. The SSPX is also not an Eastern church. Thus, similar to Canon 1248, the ability to legally satisfy the permission for sacramental sharing under Canon 844, Article 2 is tied to the church in which the sacrament is given and not merely to the validity of the minister's ordination or the missal he uses. This is another reason why Mr. Akin and Father Ripperger have erred in their interpretation of canon law and its application to SSPX Masses. Closing comments. As we have seen, a Mass fulfills the Sunday obligation only if it is observed in the Universal Church under Canon 1246, Article 1, which can be accomplished by celebrating the Mass anywhere in one of the 6 Catholic rites per Canon 1248, Article 1. Again, even if one were to narrowly interpret rite in Canon 1248, Article 1 as an approved missal or liturgy or ritual, which is untenable, that rite must still be offered in the Universal Church, which is made up of the 6 rites and 24 churches sui juris throughout the world, and include all the particular churches, dioceses, and eparchies governed by bishops with title and ordinary jurisdiction who are in union with the Pope. The Masses offered by the SSPX do not meet these requirements. When it comes to Canon 1248, Article 1, knowing enough to be dangerous is dangerous indeed. A superficial reading of the canon has led many into the spiritual danger of worshiping outside the Catholic Church and failing to meet our obligations before God. Further, as the Vatican has warned, formal adherence to schism, which results in automatic excommunication, can come about slowly over time as one separates from his bishop by frequently or habitually assisting at Masses outside of his communion. In my previous article, I go through the many negative judgments of the PCED from 1984 to 2015 on assisting at SSPX Masses. Indeed, there is not a single reply or authentic interpretation of canon law which holds that SSPX Masses fulfill the ecclesiastical precept of Canon 1248, and that is because they do not satisfy the precept. In fact, the only PCED reply which directly addressed a dubium on whether independent chapel masses, in this case associated with the SSPX, satisfied Canon 1248, concluded that such masses do not fulfill the Sunday obligation under Canon 1248, and which results in sin when such masses are attended for Sundays and holy days. And he has a reference for that. It appears that Father Ripperger and Mr. Akin do not understand the gravity of their position on the SSPX. For example, in his interview, Father Ripperger flippantly stated, quote, "If I were Pope, the first thing I would do is call the head of the SSPX and say, 'You are to be at my office at 8 in the morning,' and what I would do is when he showed up, I would write it out myself. 'You are canonically regularized. Here, go home and we will figure out the rest later,' unquote." However, both Popes John Paul II and Benedict XVI have offered the SSPX to be canonically regularized on the condition that they accept certain basic doctrinal principles and renounce certain errors, and the SSPX has refused. Evidently, it does not matter to Father Ripperger that the SSPX, inter alia, rejects the Catholic Church's profession of faith required by all who hold office in the Church, that it calls Vatican II's teaching on collegiality a heresy, that it calls the Novus Ordo Mass intrinsically evil, that it claims to have the 4 marks and the privileges of the ordinary and universal magisterium, while claiming the conciliar church, quote-unquote, has defected, that it promotes all kinds of errors and heresies on jurisdiction, mission, sacramental intention, among other things, and that it runs its own ecclesiastical, quote-unquote, tribunal, which grants marriage annulments, dispensation from vows, and the lifting of censures, and requires its adherents to swear on the Gospels that they will not approach a legitimate tribunal, but will abide by their judgments, all against the authority of the local ordinaries and the Holy See. For Father Ripperger, the SSPX should be canonically regularized by the Pope immediately, without regard to the foregoing, which is none other than its habitual separation from the Pope, his magisterium, and Catholic tradition. We live in confusing times indeed. The heresies of the early Church related primarily to Christology, the nature of Christ, but the errors and heresies of our day relate almost exclusively to ecclesiology, the nature of the Church. Indeed, a failure to understand what the Church is, specifically in her divine juridical constitution, leads to many dangerous errors, such as who is and is not a member of the Church, who has jurisdiction in the Church, how jurisdiction is lost in the Church, and even what masses satisfy the Church's ecclesiastical precepts. These errors are promoted not only by those who have formally separated from the Church, like the Sedevacantists, but also unwittingly by mainstream apologists who don't even attend SSPX chapels. This poses a grave spiritual harm because it leads many souls outside the Catholic Church, the only ark of salvation. Like the Sedevacantists, the Old Catholics, the Dominicans of Avrier, the Resistants, and other independent groups of acephalous clergy, the SSPX bishops and priests are not part of the universal Catholic Church on earth. That is why the Church considers those who attend Mass at a society chapel to not be in full communion with the Catholic Church. In fact, infidelity to their founder, SSPX bishops and priests proudly admit that they are not part of what they call the Conciliar Church of Rome, which is none other than the Roman Catholic Church. The society admits it is not legally united to any particular church or diocese, and thus does not operate within any of the 24 particular churches or 6 rites of the universal church. The society also does not have bishops with ordinary jurisdiction, and thus is not juridically united to the Pope and College of Bishops. In fact, the society is not only not part of the universal church, but readily admits that it operates contrary to the will of the universal church, that is, the Pope and College of Bishops. Father Jonathan Loop of the SSPX recently summarized it perfectly when he said the society operates, quote, contrary to the known intentions, the known will of those successors of the apostles, the princes of the church, unquote. This means SSPX masses are not, quote, observed in the universal church, unquote, and not, quote, celebrated in a Catholic rite, unquote, as required by canon law. Therefore, SSPX masses do not fulfill the Sunday obligation. End of article.